Without further ado, we are now going to move on to the other special roundtable panel, which is sponsored by the Korea Foundation. And I would first briefly like to describe what this panel is about and what it's part of a project on Japan and Korea in the evolving China-US relations. I have 6 other colleagues coming onto the panel whose faces now you can see. We just as a description, this project really started as a way of addressing a very difficult bilateral relationship, which is Korea-Japan relations. As Minishihara Sensei also mentioned, and as now everybody knows, this is one of the worst functioning bilateral relationship, which in the course of doing this project in the past year or so has got considerably worse. But it also, because we started the project before COVID, we were hoping that by doing this project, we will be able to sort of sketch out what are the risks, what are the hedgings, what's the role of Japan and Korea in a sort of slowly but evolving and changing East Asian political landscape. However, the COVID situation has fast forwarded everything on top of, particularly because, and also with the worsening bilateral relations, events and have overtaken our original assumption of trying to be sort of a cautious, but at the same time trying to address the problems of this bilateral relationship without getting sucked up into the usual sort of contestations over history, and the deeply sort of deep sense of mistrust between not only the two political leaderships, but also the two peoples, even though in terms of economic relationship as well as cultural relationship, Japan and Korea are actually compatible and very close. So this is one of the legacies, one of the last legacies, I think, of Prime Minister Abe, where apart from all the positive attributes, perhaps that his foreign and security policies have left in terms of sort of beefing up and giving direction to how Japan might pursue a more autonomous as well as sort of multilateral role in the region. How ironically, it has actually worsened the one key democratic ally in this very important sort of situation. So I think it's one of the things that I have noticed through this particular project is that Japan and Korea have overlapping interests, not only as democracies, not only as parts of the indispensable part of US hub and spoke systems, but they are also relatively influential middle-sized or middle powers who have more interest in multilateral cooperation on rule-based international order, and the similar kind of geostrategic interest in protecting, for example, having freedom of navigation, and also having a very a stake in having ASEAN countries remain coherent and also not be part of the sort of the battleground between US and Chinese rivalries. But and I also think that because of the size and also the history and also the integral part that China and Korea play within the hub and spoke system, I happen to think that some of this bilateral relationship might actually be one of the most pivotal relationship in keeping, for example, or even pursue this liberal order in this region, and also in enhancing what Professor Nishihara was talking about the sort of cooperation between democracies. So these are the sort of the takeaways from my side, and but I would actually like to introduce my panelists, and we will go in a particular order. But first of all, who are all from different fields, but also deeply, deeply concerned about what happens to the region. So first, I would just like to go in order. Is that we have Dr. Brendan Howe from the Iowa Women's University. Would you like to wave your hands, Brendan? We have Dr. June Park from the National Research Institute in Korea, and she will be talking about tech issues. We have Kei Koga from the Nanyang Technological University, who will be actually also, he is a Japanese based in Southeast Asia, which I think is wonderful. We have Zhang Pengyang from Yonsei University. Now he is a Chinese based in Seoul, which I think is also adds to the diversity. And then we have Professor Jae-woo Chu from Kyunghee University, who is actually the collaborator, the PI for this project. And finally, we have Dr. Li Ming Zhang from RSIS, also from the Nanyang Technological University, who is also a Chinese based in Singapore. So without further ado, I would actually first like to ask Brendan.
Okay.
To start our panel.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Haruko, and thank you everybody for joining us on this panel. My focus is predominantly these days on non-traditional security. And I think despite the challenges that we face in the traditional security areas, both under US and China leadership or contestation, but also in terms of the traditional security relationship between Japan and South Korea, nonetheless, we may have more cause for optimism in the non-traditional security arena. So that's what I'm going to talk about briefly for this panel. In particular, in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, at all levels of society, we've seen that the old state-centric models of security are insufficient to address the contemporary threat environment. So we need to start thinking outside the box, and we need to broaden our conceptualization of security and security cooperation to take into account these non-traditional security threats. The roles played by the disease and by government responses to it have actually generated additional conflict in this region and indeed globally. And this has revealed that if we want a sustainable peace in this region, we require far more than the management of conflict and the prevention of states going to war with each other, that this is really not even conflict management. It's just preserving frozen conflict between states. So if we want progress in this region in terms of security cooperation, we need to broaden along the x-axis and along the y-axis. So the x-axis, looking at other things that threaten us. The security is freedom from threat, freedom from existential threat. Well, it's not just other states that threaten states now. So we need to think about broadening along the x-axis to include non-state-centric threats, transnational threats, threats to non-state entities. So we need to talk about pandemics, climate change, refugees, pollution, transnational and cybercrime, human drug and weapons trafficking, all of these sorts of things, food security, water security, human security. These need to be part of our discussion about regional security cooperation. We also need to expand along the y-axis of referent object, but also the different actors. So it's not just states now, it's not just the most powerful states who we need to think about when we're thinking about security actors. We need to look at international organizations. We need to look at regional cooperation, even in this region where we have very little formal international organization and cooperation. We need to look at the role of transnational corporations. We need to look at the role of non-governmental organizations and civil societies. And I think all of this has been brought to a head under conditions of COVID-19. Great powers and great power alliances have done a particularly bad job in addressing the new security environment, I would contend. And it's not just the failures over COVID-19, it's the failure to address all of these changing circumstances, all of these new threats, transnational threats, and so on. In fact, these days, the United States, China, and Russia are all acting like monsters in a Godzilla movie, fighting each other and trampling the poor citizens of the world who can be considered the hapless citizens of Tokyo in the movies. But here the whole world is suffering as a result of this great power contestation. Now, it used to be that at least one of the great powers acted pretty responsibly. The United States could be relied on to be something of a voice of reason in terms of international security cooperation. But under Trump, that's no longer the case. And even if Trump is removed in this next election, I'm not convinced that the United States will return to a position of normalcy in terms of providing security leadership and cooperation. Now, this is particularly important in this region because this region is dominated by traditional state-centric approaches to security. It's a very state-centric Westphalian region. And as a result, there are significant challenges to addressing non-traditional security issues in this region where state sovereignty is so jealously defended. But I think that NTS issues, non-traditional security issues, have also given an opportunity to other actors to shine, and indeed potentially an opportunity for cooperation in this region. So Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all have lengthy traditions of non-traditional security promotion, especially in Southeast Asia. Actually, they all have a version of principled foreign policy towards Southeast Asia, all have versions of what's being called a new Southern policy by both South Korea and Taiwan. Japan, of course, has been promoting its human security initiatives for several decades now. Other powers of middling resource capacities, such as Vietnam and Singapore, have also won plaudits for their approaches to dealing with the COVID-19 security operating environment. But maybe as quasi-authoritarian states, I'm not going to say they're absolutely authoritarian, but certainly they're heading in that direction. Both Vietnam and Singapore may lack the moral authority to act as shining cities on the hill to replace the moral authority of the United States. Also, they may lack the societal contributions, which I would argue are increasingly important in terms of furthering non-traditional security cooperation. If we look at Taiwan, Taiwan may be too hamstrung by geopolitics to play an international leadership role in non-traditional security affairs. But if we look at South Korea and Japan, still constrained by traditional geopolitics, but increasingly they have freedom to act in these areas, and they're seizing on this ability to act in non-traditional security areas as a vital plank of their niche diplomacy, a vital area where they can get more bang for their buck or yen or won in terms of having an impact on the global stage. Now, of course, Japan and South Korea have well-publicized differences, but there are less well-known instances of cooperation in the non-traditional security area, such as in development cooperation, but also in peacekeeping operations. Sorry, my next door neighbor is apparently remodeling his apartment, so sorry if you're disturbed by the drilling noise here, but I'll just conclude by saying that with the failure of great power leadership, non-traditional security cooperation between South Korea and Japan may end up not only being in their own national interest, but also a strategic necessity. With the abdication of great power leadership, we're going to have to look to middle powers or powers of middling capacity to take up the slack. This may then ultimately spill over into other areas of cooperation between Japan and South Korea, or at least de-escalation of the rhetoric between the two and potential confidence building between the two. Now I'm going to turn off my mic now so that you don't hear any more of the drilling, but I'll rejoin later.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. I'm so sorry to the panel. I sent an order of talk today and I totally screwed up. So I'm going to go back to what it was supposed to be. So I'd like to invite Jae-woo, because he's the instigator of this project. And we go a long way back in talking about the two Japan-Korea relations. And I'd like to take up on the theme of what Brendan just talked about in terms of how we can actually cooperate more, go beyond the rhetoric, but how we calibrate our national leaders and policy making in order for those things to be sort of realizable. My understanding at the moment is, and this is something that I noticed when I recently wrote this paper on Japan-Korea relations as a very fragile relationship, is that both are hung up on rhetoric. They both seem to have some sort of a broad, if not broad, at least a particular support base domestically to be against each other. And I'm going to state this actually, I don't mean to offend South Korea, but one thing I noticed is that South Korea, by being very anti-Japan, makes itself in a much more vulnerable position strategically or security-wise, particularly in balance with in the context of US-China rivalry. It's because we saw with the THAAD incident where Chinese economic sanctions against Korea hurts Korea more than, for example, Japan's ability to somehow hedge and fend off economic sanctions, for example, with rare metals over the Senkaku Ryu incident in 2010, which means the economic fundamentals alone, I think, make the South Korean sort of driving away Japan in a way disadvantageous to Korea itself. This is, and I think this also, of course, from the American point of view, I think that would be the case. But I think it's not really just about, it's a matter of South Korea's long-term vision, including views about reunification or a nuclear North Korea, which I think at least under President Moon Jae-in's leadership, has somehow gone astray, or rather it's very, at least a radical departure from the past, where previous presidents, particularly in relation to Japan, would be very cautious about, at least in, sort of not sort of explicitly anti-Japan. But, and in the end, you'll have at the end of the 5-year term, you get the sort of, the nominal sort of anti-Japan sort of stab here and there. But President Moon's presidency has very much, from our perspective, relied on aggravating things, to the point where I think even the ordinary Japanese, who are usually, apolitical, but they kind of turns on this, incensed feeling towards Korea being perhaps too anti-Japan. But likewise, I think President Moon had a match with Prime Minister Abe, when he, for example, decided last year to curb the exports of materials that were needed for the semiconductor industry, particularly in terms of making mobile phones and so on and so forth, which I think came also both as a shock to the Japanese business community, as well as, I think, even to the Koreans. And I think the dogged determination for both Abe and Moon not to sort of back off, to the point of threatening, particularly with South Korea, with the withdrawal or the termination of the GSOMIA Treaty, which is the treaty agreement to share security and military intelligence between the two countries. I think it just went out of control. And I think Prime Minister Abe also, I think, underestimated how President Moon might respond. So there's been a kind of unreasonable and as responses from both sides. But and it's created such a sort of a thorny atmosphere where one of them will probably, or both of them may have to change in order for anything to be set in a sort of a, if not a clean slate, but at least a less sort of animosity driven and sort of way of talking to each other. And this is, I think, where Brendan's suggestion that, yes, underneath the surface, that there is cooperation between Japan and Korea on many things. But the point is that we cannot explicitly be seen to be cooperating, whether it's at the UN or, or even with, say, for example, future maybe development cooperation in ASEAN. So I think this is something that I'm beginning to feel that we both need to recalibrate, but I do wonder, what's your view on how South Korea's sort of situation or policy making could change? Is it irreparably gone to the end of, we don't want Japan, we would rather die than work with Japan, or is this something we can do? Thank you.
I don't know. Thank you, Haruko. Great to see you all. Well, it's always a tough question here, but let's see. I don't know where I should start. It's just so complicated. It's like, I don't know where the Gordian knot is, but I like to start my talk by raising a question to all. I think Brendan touched on NTS, and I don't know if we want our project to go with NTS instead of emerging security, because I think that's a term that a lot of people think that is more academic and more academically well-defined, better defined than NTS. What do you think, Brendan? I think there's a discourse about differentiating between NTS and emerging security issues. Well, okay, we can talk about that later. Yeah. And then, well, I totally agree with Brendan's point of view on X and Y here. And I think there's one variable here that that really impedes our cooperation with Japan to make progress, and it's politicization and securitization of NTS. I think whether the politicization of NTS issues is for domestic consumption or for domestic political purposes, well, that's debatable. But if we study, NTS and the need for cooperation on the NTS front, then we have that idea, and ideation is pretty much made progress as to why we need to cooperate on these particular issues.
Actually, Joe, I've now been unmuted, so I can now
okay.
your question about NTS versus emerging versus new security challenges.
Yeah.
In the literature, the new security challenges are primarily new challenges to state security.
Okay.
And non-traditional security challenges can either be new security challenges, or they can be with a different referent object. So instead of looking at challenges to states, you look at challenges to other referent objects, whether it be human security or societal security or regime security, or vulnerable groups and individuals. Now, emerging security challenges, I think, is actually less well defined than either of the other two.
Okay.
Well, we can look at that later when we come to firming up the proposal.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah. So going back to my argument of politicization and securitization of NTS, I think that's where we're stuck, really. We all understand that cooperation is the most effective way of overcoming these challenges posed by NTS issues. That's for sure. For instance, energy security. We all know that if three countries, China, Japan, Korea, if we all cooperate together, then we are all winners here. But for some reason, we all think that energy is vital to our security and the state defense. So along the course, states tend to really securitize, politicize the need to better secure energy. And in the end, the securitization of the NTS issue is materialized by the end of the day, and that's pretty sad. And once I think NTS issues are securitized and politicized, then I think they're rather categorized in traditional security terms, and it really precludes cooperation among the three countries, or referent objects here. So I think when we talk about better cooperation for NTS, I think we need to really seriously look into the politicization and securitization process of these two countries, especially Japan and Korea. And I think that can be applied to also defending our sea lanes in Southeast Asia, because in geopolitical terms, I think once the 9-dash line is confirmed, and if it becomes China's, then I think the most damaged country would be South Korea, because if you look at all these countries along the 9-dash line, they're all island countries. And Indochina Peninsula countries, we can exclude them because they have easy access to Malacca Strait, and they don't necessarily have to go through, South China Seas. So I think Korea should realize the danger of politicizing and securitizing NTS issues here. And coming to sanctions, I think as a result of many issues being politicized and securitized on the foreign policy agendas between the two countries, between Japan and Korea, I think the unfortunate measures that these countries adopted in retaliation is sanctions. And if you look at Korean case now, it is for the first time in 75 years that both countries, both North and South Korea, are being sanctioned by the neighboring states. This is so unfortunate. South Korea is being sanctioned by China and Japan, while North Korea is also being sanctioned by China and Japan a long time ago, which is still effective to date. And well, with the way the United States is probably moving with this geopolitical strategy, I think we can only expect more deployment of weapons that will be displeasing to China's interest. And probably we can expect more sanctions on the way from China, and because of Trump rebuked INF, and obviously South Korea and the United States agreed on removal of payloads on the missiles, so which allows the United States to deploy more intermediate range missiles that are capable of loading nuclear warheads. And I don't think that's going to make China too happy. And we can sort of predict the reactions from China based on the past cases. And with the way Korea is moving with Japan, especially Moon government is not making any concession to the rulings or even GSOMIA. And I don't know with what kind of leadership is going to come into Japan, but certainly looking at Moon's current standing on Japan's policy, well, I don't think it'll be too pleasing to the new leadership in Japan, and only if he's going to take much more harder line on South Korea, then who knows. So I think with this gloomy picture, I think this is where Brendan pushed the right button here. I think great power and great power allies, they have to play more constructive and more positive role here. Well, by this, school of liberal thought, we know that we have the idea as to what we should do when it comes to resolving NTS issues. And that idea has spread well through ideation process. And then we try to build up institutions, and we're well aware it's well laid out in Haruko's article that we all got. But I think the only absence is leadership by the great power here. But when we're talking about leadership by the great power, I don't think we should necessarily count in the United States. But when you look at in the context of the region and regional politics, that we're talking about China and Japan here. And if we can develop this idea, I like to really emphasize on the leadership role that Japan should play as a so that we can reach to some kind of more concrete conclusion to our argument in our project, that Korea can really play some leadership as a middle power, but Japan as a regional power, if not great power. But Japan's role as a regional power should not be underestimated or overlooked by our research. And I think we should come up with more concrete and constructive proposals or suggestions as to how Japan should play a much more constructive leadership in the regional affairs. Because with China rising as a communist state, which I totally agree, I think the value of democracy and liberal ideas and liberalism could be in danger. So I think this is where the allies of the ally of democracies should show some unity, and to achieve that end, really a much bigger power like Japan should play a more constructive role here as a leader. So I think hopefully I can get some consensus on this particular point so that we can be really more provocative with our conclusion in our project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jae-woo. Okay, we're now going to turn to Zhang Feng.
Oh, hi.
Hi. And I know you're focusing more on US-China relations, so you can either start with a comment on what we've been discussing, or you just put in your thoughts.
Okay. Well, actually, in this sort of discussion, I'm interested in talking about the different strategic outlook of South Korea and Japan, you know, in between China and the United States. Actually, so basically it's more kind of comparison, contrast of South Korea and Japan in this sort of geopolitical context, which a lot of people have been taken as the same for a long time, because come to think of it, you know, Japan, South Korea, both in the hub and spoke system, blah, 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 both the US allies. But what I'm trying to say is that the situation for South Korea and Japan geopolitically and strategically are quite different. And of course, this doesn't go directly to the question that we've been discussing, maybe tangentially, but well, this is all I have. This is more about sort of geopolitical and strategic positioning, but I think it does have some sort of a bearing on the bilateral relations to some extent. To what extent, I don't know. But I think there was an article in International Affairs 2018 by Sakakia and Nishino talking about sort of the divergence of South Korea and Japan strategically with respect to how to deal with China and North Korea as well to some extent. I think what I'm going to say is that but I take that as a sort of a point of departure. I think this is my basic argument is that this is perhaps sort of structurally determined, given the sort of different strategic imperatives and priorities South Korea has from what Japan has in relation to different actors in the region. So, and of course, you know, between China and the United States, this is a very familiar territory for all of us. And of course, it has long been said, I think the person I remember most memorable was Eikenberry talking about, China and Japan, or just maybe just the whole overall region, the Northeast and Southeast Asia, more kind of economically dependent on China in terms of market access and trade. And of course, more dependent on the United States for security guarantee. So yeah, in that sense, all these countries are treated the same. But I think when we talk about, but if you look closer, I think I would make an argument that South Korea and Japan are really different in the sense that they're in different situations, that in different geopolitical milieu and context. Therefore, the national priorities and threat perceptions are different. Therefore, I think it's going to become, as US-China competition gets ever more heightened and pronounced, the fissure, geostrategic fissure between Japan and South Korea is going to get even wider probably. And then of course, that's going to complicate South Korea's foreign policy and strategic planning. But I would say inevitably that's going to have an impact on the bilateral relations as well. So let me go back to go to this sort of I would say all Korean sort of perspective, because while we were talking about South Korea and Japan, between China and the United States, we haven't really talked about North Korea. Because yeah, it's Northeast Asia. I mean, from where I am, it's just not that far away. And I hear people in South Korea constantly aware of its existence. I'm talking about North Korea. So in that sense, when we talk about South Korea's geostrategic planning or position or whatever, we're, because the two Koreas, they're like cut from the same cloth and two pieces in one pod. And therefore they have to come in one set, and that, so whatever South Korea does with respect to strategy, with respect to outside powers, they have to take into consideration the question of how to deal with North Korea, and that really complicates the matter, and that makes South Korea's position very, very difficult and complex, which is a sort of a situation that Japan is not necessarily in, because it's a lot more strategically straightforward for Japan. So in essence, for South Koreans, because there are two Koreas, they're really just one set. Therefore, all Koreans care about peace, stability, denuclearization, unification, all these things that have maybe, I guess, for the Japanese might be interested in those things, but to much lesser extent. And of course, the underlying sort of a pan-Korean nationalism is something we cannot discount. Let me just take, for instance, it is astounding that in the wake of the first Inter-Korea Summit, Moon Jae-in meeting with Kim Jong-un in April, what is it, 80%, close to 80% of South Koreans polled had sort of positive feelings about Kim Jong-un. That was like, from what I read, I don't know how reliable these polls are, but they're widely cited. From what I read, it was like about 10% just of the same poll conducted 2 months ago. And of course, talking about 80% of South Koreans having sort of warm feelings and finding Kim Jong-un trustworthy, it's astounding on so many levels. I mean, considering this guy who's so brutal and ruthlessly killed his half-brother, his uncle, and now South Koreans finding him sort of trustworthy. So I think South Koreans, I mean, each time you have those inter-Korean summits and of course, joint appearances at major world events such as the Olympics, there's always a sort of a surge of nationalist adrenaline, so to speak, in South Korea. And that really just dredged up a lot of pan-Korean nationalism. And of course, that gives sort of, that underpins the sort of positioning, geopolitical positioning for South Korea as well. Not to mention that, the stakes have been raised so high with the nuclearization of North Korea. So in that sense, well, this goes back to a paper I'm trying to finish. In that sense, I would make an argument that the Koreans, here we are talking about South Korea, North Korea, and China and Japan, North and South Korea and China, the United States, in a security system of its own. That excludes Japan because Japan is really peripheral to issues of denuclearization and unification and long-term peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, and that explains, talking about Abe, who came into power just a few months after Kim Jong-un took over from his dead father. I mean, yeah, just of course it's been, it's sense of deja vu we have, but just between 2018 and 19, there were like 5-6 summit between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, and of course three inter-Korea summit. There was Donald Trump, of course, but even Putin met with Kim Jong-un. But Abe wanted to meet him after, but of course it hasn't really materialized, and that shows how marginalized South Korea has been from the stage that the Koreans think they reside, and of course that just gives you a sense of how diverged in terms of the national priorities and strategic sort of weights are with respect to the Koreans and South Koreans and Japan. So they have different priorities, they have different national interests. And of course that have, talking about South Korea, going back to South Korea, that has kind of polarized inevitably domestic politics in South Korea, but it has bearings on South Korea's positioning between China and Japan to some extent. But it just makes it so much harder for South Korea and so much more make them waver and of course dither in terms of which side to choose, in spite of the fact that there is a security alliance between South Korea and the United States. So, and then of course we have to go back to the THAAD dispute, and it's from the Chinese perspective, THAAD was basically like a proxy, South Korea acting as a proxy, a Trojan horse of some sort for the United States. That really takes the cover off the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. So yeah, so what I'm saying, and of course, just 2 weeks ago, the Yang Jiechi was in Busan trying to get this.
Yang, you have to finish soon.
Okay, I'm cut, So yeah, to wrap up, just in one sentence, I think just for Japan, it's so much simpler and straightforward between China or the United States. For South Korea, it's a lot more complicated. Therefore, their priorities are different, and that complicates a lot of things, and Japan-South Korea relations included. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to go, so now I'm going to turn to Kay. Yang's given us a reality check, but
Rumbling.
I'd like to invite Kay now for the intervention, as well as what you were talking about, the Japan, India, the stuff that you actually wanted to talk about. So. Wait, unmute. I'll unmute. Can you unmute, Kay?
Yeah, I did. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm Kei Koga from the Nanyang Technological University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Japan, South Korea, and India relations. As every panelist on this session, in this session actually talks about the Japan-South Korea relations, and then the bilateral relation is pretty bad, and then but shape, and we don't actually have the kind of concrete solution for that. I understand because I've also studied about these bilateral relations, and then since I'm actually focusing on the Asia's kind of multilateralism, minilateralism, and also the trilateralism, I just would like to kind of do the sort of experience if there's any possibility that we can actually facilitate the Japan-South Korea relations. I mean, good Japan-South Korea relations in the multilateral setting. And I understand there are several multilateral settings in the Japan, South Korea relations, which include the ASEAN-led institution, East Asia Summit, ASEAN +3, these multilateral institutions. And also there are several trilateral institutions like a +3 summit or +3 meeting among the China, Japan, and South Korea, as well as the informally Japan, South Korea, and the United States. But then it didn't actually go well. I mean, it didn't actually improve the relationship between the Japan and the South Korea. So I'm kind of wondering if there is any way that like we can actually facilitate those bilateral relations in the different setting, and which actually includes China, India. And what I'm going to talk about is basically the one's the background, how the geostrategic relations are currently in East Asia, and then the bilateral relations between the Japan, South Korea, India, and Japan and India. And then later on, I just going to talk about the potential area of cooperation among three and the possibility to facilitate the better the bilateral relations between the Japan and South Korea. So first off, everybody or most of the people already talked about the geopolitical setting in East Asia. And then we all know the China, United States, US rivalry is rising. And then there are many frictions, trade, security in many areas between these two great powers. But at the same time, we could actually see two kinds of trend in the East Asia. The one is the emergence of the strategic visions of the those middle powers and also regional powers. Japan, as you may have already known, free and open in the Pacific strategy or free and open in the Pacific vision came out in 2016. South Korea provided the Moon administration launched the New Southern policy, and also the India, as Modi always emphasized, the Act East policy. So I think in the midst of these two strategic rivalries between the United States and China, these actually strategic vision came out. And the second one is the rise of minilateralism. So currently the most actually debated the framework is the Quad, and then the Japan, United States, India, Australia got together and they informally institutionalized this kind of framework by the conducting the senior offshore meetings as well as the ministerial meeting. And then the Pompeo actually said we are going to have the Quad meeting in this later this year. I'm not sure if it is going to be ministerial or the senior officials, but most likely it could be the ministerial. So in that sense, the level of those Quads or like multilateralism is actually getting more importance. So these are two trends that we could see, but then at the same time, these are still vague. Those kind of strategic visions that middle powers and regional powers provided are still not sure like to what extent it actually could transfer into the concrete policy or concrete actions. Also, although like they are saying these are actually we are providing the infrastructure development, we are actually facilitating free trade areas and so on and so forth. But like, these are the kind of actions that has been already taken before. So in that sense, not sure. And then minilateralism, we are not sure to what extent the Quad is going to be institutionalized formally. So, I mean, there are given the differences in the national interest and the commitment to the region, and also the existing differences in the existing the perception gap, still, like there are many uncertainties here. So in this backdrop, against this backdrop, I think what we could actually see is if there is any other kind of framework we could actually look at. And then I think Japan, ROK, India has, I mean, obviously it's sometimes people say perhaps the most unlikely the framework, but then it could actually give the some potentials, because the most of these countries actually try to reduce the too much dependence on those the great powers, including the United States and China. United States, we are not certain about the future of the United States. Domestically, it's actually the politically kind of mess, and then we need to actually see to what extent they could actually commit, or they could actually invest those political resources or diplomatic resources to the Indo-Pacific or the East Asia. And also the China, we are not sure. I mean, we've already seen that the China is increasingly assertive in the maritime domain, and then they are actually, amid the COVID-19, they're increasing those kind of the assertiveness. So what we could actually see is the if these middle powers and regional states could cooperate with each other, then we could actually reduce the dependence. I mean, too much dependence on those powers as well. So let me explain the current status of bilateral relations between those three countries. On the Japan and South Korea, I think they are trying to improve the relations for a long time. And then since the 1999, when they actually adopted the joint declaration for the new partnership, the relation actually got improved. But again, what is missing here is that they actually, surprisingly, they didn't institutionalize this kind of relationship. They actually have some institutional framework, but it's actually in the context of the multilateral framework, as I said, the +3 framework and so on and so forth. So that actually gives you some kind of implication about the relationship, because if there is certain kind of political political obstacle, like historical issue comes up, then they just stop doing the kind of diplomatic exchanges. So I think the institutionalization of these two bilateral relations are really important, and we usually assume that like they're kind of the relationships are already institutionalized because of the intensive interactions between these two countries, but it's actually not. I mean, so if you actually look at the diplomatic record, surprisingly, it's not. And then informally, yes. I mean, like informally, people, if you ask the military officers or so, maybe they would say, oh, we are actually talking to each other. But again, like if this is informal, they could always have a chance to kind of quit it or stop it for a while. So I think like this is a really, really big setback for the bilateral relations. And that's Japan, South Korea, and then we need to actually somehow do some institutionalization. Japan-India relations actually getting better because since 2000, when the Prime Minister Modi actually visited India, they started to accumulate the cooperative frameworks in the starting from the economic field. And now like we have seen the 2+2, and then also the defense and then foreign ministers meeting, and then the political dialogue, leadership exchange, and then also the public exchanges. So I think even though again like there is a certain political perception gap, their kind of bilateral relation is expanding. South Korea, India is probably weakest link, but the South Korea actually started to have the agenda for again like the southern the new southern policy, which includes the India, and also they started to consider. They actually launched the concept of J-economics. I think it's like J-economics. That is the South Korea with the ASEAN countries and with the India. The South Korea was actually trying to strengthen the economic tie with the India too. So in that sense, I think Japan, India, and South Korea, India relations are getting stronger, while like Japan and South Korean relations are kind of like the stasis. So if we actually consider India as a hub, and then like we could actually push forward the cooperation among the three, and then there are more actually the opportunity for Japan and South Korea to talk to each other in the particular kind of functional areas. And then I think like the functional area could be the digital infrastructure cooperation, given the India has the human resources, South Korea has the 5G. I think the more important the technological edge, and then Japan has the experience in the infrastructure development. So if we actually somehow started to kind of cooperate with each other in these areas, then there might be some possibility on that. Obviously, again, like there are several limitations. We don't know to what extent COVID-19 is going to affect those countries, and also maybe the commitment to, again, like the diplomatic I think the diplomatic commitment to the region might relatively kind of getting low if the COVID-19 affects a lot in these countries, particularly India, when we actually see the situation. So there are many uncertainties, but like this is just kind of one sort of experience. Maybe we could actually push forward. Thank you very much. Sorry, I actually exceeded the time.
Thank you, Kay. I think you've actually given the perfect prelude to June. We're talking about the tech side of things.
Right.
So now I'd like to turn the mic to June. Somebody unmute her. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yep.
Am I there?
Yes, you're there.
Before I begin, I think I'll share with everyone in the chat room, this platform, the Open Asia article that was published just for the update in the issue since our May meeting on online. For this specific project and the peer-reviewed journal submission that we will do together, as the only political economist in the group, I feel a sense of responsibility to keep on updating what is going on in the tech realm in relation to the economic conflict between the US and China and how that impacts Japan and South Korea's bilateral relationship. This article that I just shared is an update from the East Asia Forum article that I shared in May when there was a question from the audience. So I will put that here as well. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly sort of theoretically link my work to some of the previous comments made, especially by Brendan, Haruko, and Jae-woo. So perhaps more with Brendan. So the non-traditional security realm that is being heightened in the context of tech, I think there is a convergence between geopolitical and geoeconomic realms. And this goes hand in hand together. It can't be separated anymore. And in the context of that kind of setting, theoretical setting, there are changes, so many changes that happen on a day-to-day basis that make us, that makes things difficult to predict and that make us vulnerable to the changes, the expectation of other changes that would come along. And the article that I would be contributing is called COVID-19 Contactless Economy and the Acceleration of Tech Wars. The US-China Race for Supremacy in AI, Enforcing South Korea-Japan Chip Wars meaning semiconductors. And what I'd like to do is briefly sort of outline how my contribution would be situated in the context of our project, and perhaps give some geopolitical / geoeconomic angles to this, why that conflict will be further heightened even after whoever becomes president in November in the US, and what this article might be able to do in terms of explaining that acceleration of tech wars, especially by COVID-19. So those two things that I would keep in mind in the next 5 minutes or so, and I would lastly give you some updates on the leadership changes that may occur in both Japan and South Korea, and then a little bit more update on the semiconductor sector. So we all know that the US-China tech split is ongoing, and chances are maybe not a complete economic decoupling, but tech decoupling highly likely, although it would take time. And at the crux of that, you may recall last month, around mid-July, the UK announced phase out of Huawei technology and the 5G infrastructure for the UK. And a week after that, France announcing a similar guideline to ban all Huawei supplies from France's 5G development. And how this is really linked to all of this that we're talking about, US, China, and Japan, South Korea, it's linked to semiconductors. Basically, the entity list by the Commerce Department in the US, banning all kinds of transactions with Huawei to curb semiconductor supply to Huawei and other interested affiliates is at the core of these policies. And when we ask the research question of how that coupling in tech is further accelerated by COVID-19, this is humongous. It's not just about South Korea, Japan semiconductor dispute and the WTO case, but it's more about who gets to rule and who gets to obtain revenue from widespread worldwide standardization. That's the geopolitical part of what we are in right now in terms of US, China, Japan, South Korea, export curbs. The US is indeed ahead of everybody else in terms of system chips, system semiconductors. South Korea may be ahead of everybody else in terms of memory chips, but that can't be guaranteed for the rest of human history. There is a change in the leadership as the industry progresses. And the real driving force behind the tech war is the US drive to curb advanced semiconductors to China, not just Huawei, but China as a whole. And TSMC, as I explained in May, is a prime example that shows that kind of development. And I would dare say that not just in the system chips, but in the memory chip realm, there may be US sanctions in the future, and Samsung and SK Hynix may come under US scrutiny. And on the geoeconomic part of chip wars and COVID-19, we all know in this kind of setting, the contactless economy has brought to us detachment of human life. And what the market would require as time goes by and this process is lengthened is the demand for technology that requires contactless operations in everyday life. And industries will be a boon for semiconductor applications, so system chips and memory chips, both of them. And in the timeline that I explained earlier on, how this is accelerated, I think it would be useful to divide it into pre-trade war. Pre-trade war meaning pre-January 2018, investigations on Huawei by the US had begun even from 2012, if you recall. Pre-COVID, during the US-China trade war is after January 2018, but before January 2019. There were the export curbs between Japan levying export curbs, and there was also the US-China trade deal just in the phase of outbreak, worldwide outbreak, but we don't know where this is going. And post-COVID tech war, AI, surveillance issues, we have entity list, we have TikTok, we have WeChat, TSMC, South Korea, Japan, WTO dispute case filed. So we see a lot of these array of events that are so interlinked with post-COVID tech war. And we have leadership change. So what is likely to occur in the post-COVID tech war, I hope there would be a post-COVID era, chances are the contactless economy may have become the norm by then. The US and China may have split in tech indefinitely. And post-US presidential election in November, this may get more exacerbated. Because both sides of the aisle in the US agree about China. There is no doubt about that. Just on the optics on leadership changes, I do not believe that a prime minister change in Japan would bring about appeasement strategies or any kind of betterment in the semiconductor dispute case that is ongoing, or the tech conflict for that matter, unfortunately. And on the South Korean optics, Lee Nak-yeon has been selected as representative for the Democratic Party of Korea and would probably run as presidential hopeful. There are some uncertainties and there is still time left until next year, but we'll have to see. Lee Nak-yeon is a little bit more connected with Japan than other presidential hopefuls. But at the same time, what I question all the time regarding all of these chip-related developments and tech-related developments is, what's the real drive? It's not just the South Korea-Japan dynamic, it's bigger. It's mainly the US and China, and that sort of accelerates and gives power as a drive to create the conflict that is witnessed by us on a daily basis. So I'll end it there and I'll take questions. I ended within 10 minutes, great.
Okay, thank you, Jun. So finally, we are able to get Ming Zhang. You have the final say in all of this so please. And so if you can end in 10 minutes, then we'll be able to take some questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ruko-san. It's very good to see so many good friends online. Let me make two caveats for my presentation. This paper is unfinished. I'm very sorry about this. And also, the paper that I'm going to present does not seem to be closely aligned to the topic of this panel, but I will try to find a way to waive the paper and discussion to Korea and Japan later when it comes to publication, perhaps. So what I'm going to do is to give an introduction of this semi-product, partially finished paper. And the paper is about an assessment of China's health Silk Road in the context of COVID-19. And I try to address the question whether China's health diplomacy in the past half year or so helped China's soft power. So this is what I'm going to do. And a bit of background about this, the health Silk Road. And many of us know that the historical Silk Road is famous for its role of promoting trade across the Eurasia. But it's less known that the route has also functioned as a channel for public health cooperation. Around 2,000 years ago, for instance, people along the Silk Road had witnessed the dissemination of Chinese medicines or treatment, such as acupuncture, as well as other medical products that came from Africa, Arabian countries, India, Greece, etc., etc. So it is no surprise that in the past few years, public health cooperation has been resurrected as part of the whole Belt and Road Initiative. And the Chinese government has come up with this terminology, health Silk Road. In 2015, the Chinese National Health and Family Planning Commission, which is an official government body in China, published a 3-year plan for the Belt and Road Health Exchange and Cooperation. And the document, this policy document, envisaged the establishment of various cooperative mechanisms. For instance, a Silk Road Health Cooperation Forum, China-ASEAN Health Cooperation Forum, China, Central and Eastern Europe Health Ministers Forum, and China-Arab Health Cooperation Forum. So it was really a lot of ideas and proposals for multilateral cooperation on health. Chinese President Xi Jinping officially raised the notion of health Silk Road during his visit to Uzbekistan in 2016. In a speech in Uzbekistan, he highlighted health cooperation and collaboration in various fields, for instance, the reporting pandemics, outbreak, disease control and prevention, medical assistance, and joint development of traditional medicines. So China began to take actions to build this health Silk Road, starting from 2013. And a lot of activities got accelerated after 2015 and 2016. And there are many details I will skip. Let me focus on some of the major activities. For instance, the Chinese initiative, which is called Lifeline Express Project, managed to operate beyond China in line with the BRI, and the Chinese doctors have treated patients, thousands of them, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Uzbekistan, Myanmar, etc., etc. And some of us probably know the Chinese naval hospital ship, the Peace Ark, launched the Mission Harmony sort of voyage to many parts of the world to offer medical services to people in middle income or low income countries. And at the multilateral level, China also attempted to more actively engage various international institutions for the purpose of promoting the health Silk Road. In January 2017, for instance, China and WHO signed an MOU pledging cooperation to improve people's health in BRI countries. And later in the same year, China convened a fairly large scale Belt and Road high-level meeting for health cooperation. And this meeting clearly indicated Beijing's strong interests in playing a bigger role in global health governance. And representatives from more than 30 countries and various international organizations signed the Beijing communique of the Belt and Road Health Cooperation and Health Silk Road, which apparently helped push for the multilateral cooperation mechanisms and cooperation that the 3-year plan, which I mentioned a moment ago, had proposed. It looks like the health Silk Road had a good start before the pandemic, COVID-19. But the outbreak of COVID-19 in Wuhan in December 2019 and January 2020, and the subsequent worldwide spread of the virus created a completely different context for the implementation of China's health Silk Road. For some obvious reasons, the authorities in Beijing very hurriedly picked up the health Silk Road idea as part of China's emergency diplomacy, or health diplomacy, or mass diplomacy, as some international media outlets have often called. I will provide some examples and data with regard to China's health diplomacy in the context of COVID-19. For instance, in China's interactions with Italy, Chinese leader Xi Jinping very openly pledged to increase medical assistance and offered to jointly establish health Silk Road in his phone call with the Italian Prime Minister. And a huge amount of medical equipment products was transported by the China Railway Expresses. Some of you probably know these are the trains that run from China and arrive in Europe. It has been going on for a number of years. And this China-Europe Railway transport undertook the essential role of carrying medical supplies, living materials, and other protection equipment to many European countries. I'll give you some data. For instance, in the first half of 2020, in the 6th month of this year, these trains operated over 5,000 shifts, an increase of 36% over the same period last year. And these trains delivered 3.67 million pieces of medical supplies, and total of 461,000 TEUs of goods to countries like Italy, Germany, Netherlands, France, Spain. In addition to European countries, according to Chinese official data, China in total exported medical stuff to almost 200 countries. And these products include 70.6 billion surgical masks, 340 million protective suits, and millions of respirators and testing kits. And there are many other activities between China and Southeast Asia. Obviously, neighborhood diplomacy has always been a priority for the Chinese government. So there's been quite intense interactions between China and ASEAN countries in terms of health cooperation in the past few months. There were other activities involving China in terms of health diplomacy in Africa, in Latin America. But in any case, given time constraint, I won't get into the details. I have all the numbers and the facts in the paper. But let me move on to talk about impacts of the health sector role and health diplomacy on China's soft power.
Mingjiang, yep. we have to cut you off in about a couple of minutes. All right.
Okay, just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Yes. Okay. And there are some positive soft power results for China, mainly from the developing countries. Let me just give you one example. In January 2020, there was a survey among 53 countries. Most of the countries, most of the respondents in the survey believe that China handled the crisis, the pandemic crisis well. And in comparison, only 3 out of the 53 countries consider the US performed better. But obviously, I think some of us have already discussed in this panel, the results in terms of soft power for China in the Western countries are very different. A lot of the responses are very negative. For instance, you look at the Pew Research Center study, 64% of people in Western countries believe that China had poorly handled COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. So let me conclude. I would say that China's health diplomacy under the health circle role and in the context of the COVID-19 has not really made much difference to China's soft power. It basically reveals some of the same patterns in China's soft power that we have seen in the past 20 or 30 years. Namely, it tends to do well in the developing world, but there's always a huge deficit when it comes to China's soft power in the Western world. So I'll stop here and perhaps we can pick up some questions. Thank you, Haruka-san.
Okay, thank you, Mingjiang. Yes, I think we've, so we have about 6 minutes. If we have any questions or amongst ourselves as well, I think we could hold some. I actually had a question actually to Kay. Not a question. I thought the idea of India being the hub for enhanced sort of, Japan-Korea dialogue, at least, and cooperation was very interesting. So I was wondering if you, and that point you make about the need of a more institutionalized ROK-Japan relations was also very interesting too. But the India being hub, I thought was quite a new idea. So I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think this is, I actually came up with some idea before COVID-19. So it was, I don't know to what extent it's actually this idea is sustainable. I have to actually figure out like really in depth later on. But I think still the reason why I think the India could be the important hub for Japan and South Korea is because usually those multilateral settings that Japan, Japan and South Korea involved actually includes those great powers like China and the United States. And then because of them, I think there are certain kind of political forces that like Japan or like South Korea need to kind of comply with what they said. So if China said that, and probably like South Korea needs to kind of modify, but then does not like disagree. And then for if the United States something, then Japan actually needed to actually comply with to some extent. So in that sense, I think if India is there, then like both countries doesn't really have to worry too much about the kind of really the frank. I mean, they could actually conduct perhaps the frank discussion. And then the functional corporate, even though politically they are different, and then also there are big kind of differences in the national interests, and then also the geopolitical interests among the three. I think the economic incentives that they have can be the kind of the driving force for them to cooperate with each other. And then the one thing about the middle power cooperation among them could be the viable is to make or to sustain so-called rules-based order. I think if the great power competition goes really, really hard, then perhaps it could. There's a fear that the power politics could be the only how do you say game in town. So in that sense, I think the middle power and the regional power doesn't really want that. And then they probably like want to actually stick to the so-called like really rules-based order because middle powers and the small powers can benefit out of it. So in that case, I think those kind of three can actually have the common interest to push forward. And then the one kind of the area of cooperation could be the digital one because that was the kind of where the US-China rivalry got like really, really intensified. So that's the why I said that. But like, again, like I understand your, I mean, not kind of concern. Like,
No. Actually, no.
Yeah, but so yeah, no. So I mean, like I really need to actually delve into that again. But that's kind of my take.
I'm actually not concerned. Actually, okay. Brenton, do you have a thought about this? I think it's interesting.
Who? Me?
Brendan.
Oh,
absolutely. I must admit, I hadn't thought of India playing this role, but certainly I agree that with regional cooperation, maybe sometimes it's a better idea to keep the great powers out of it, especially they have a propensity to screw things up. And I think this is one of the problems that Japan is partially to blame for this, that whenever there's a suggestion for regional cooperation, Japan is always very keen to bring the United States in. And I think that's really problematic in terms of Japan's performance as well, because of the whole reactive state hypothesis, that if Japan is so keen to have the US in there, why would anyone listen to what Japan has to say from its own perspective? So China I'm more ambivalent about, because, as was previously mentioned, China is starting to offer an Asian perspective on non-traditional security cooperation. But sure, if we're going to kick the US out, why don't we kick China out as well, and look for not just middle powers, but medium-ranking powers in the region. The reason I haven't thought about India before is because my focus is primarily on Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia rather than South Asia. And frankly, I think South Asia may have enough of its own problems anyway. But it's certainly an idea. I think it's potentially a useful nexus. So if you're looking at a future quad, maybe the future quad should be India, Japan, South Korea, Australia.
Yep. That's a very interesting one. On that note, I'm sorry, I have to hand over properly the session to the next virtual tour of the Hyogo Arts Museum. So Joe, can you just please wait for 15 seconds while I thank all my panelists for waiting patiently and also being sort of harassed for time, and also for all the participants listen to this. And I hope to be able to continue this conversation one way or the other. Now I'm going to hand over the microphone to Joe. Thank you very much.